Hey all, this is the video for Chapter 9, Drug Abuse and Addiction. I really like this chapter. I like the in-depth description that this chapter provides of the sort of history behind drugs of abuse and addiction. Those of you that had me for issues and addictions, you had a little bit of this. We touched on the history of addictions, I think, very early on in that class. I just really like that this chapter goes into a bit more detail and a bit more description. I like the way that this chapter, and pay attention in the early sections, those 260s, page 267, 268, the way that this chapter talks about the way our society has viewed drugs of abuse and addiction, and particularly um, the way that we have transitioned from things being legal and justified. So drugs of abuse were, as you can read, were at one point legal and justified for use to now illegal, and maybe there's some validity for some drugs being illegal and some drugs for some not so much validity for other drugs being legal. There's a talking about alcohol and nicotine and compare and contrast that with maybe something like marijuana. But what I would like for you to know, and again, I'm gonna not go through every single one of these PowerPoints. Your book, it's a heavy book, and there's a lot of PowerPoints that go along with it, and so I'm going to touch on some of the high points. I like that the PowerPoint jumps off with how can a person develop and maintain a pattern of behavior that is so obviously destructive to his or her life. Well, the chapters that we've just discussed previously support this question. They don't have a choice. It's not a matter of, oh, I'm just going to stop. If it were that easy, you wouldn't be taking a class and we wouldn't need addiction counselors. We wouldn't need folks to work with individuals who truly cannot make that choice. There's obviously very strong physical component to the development of addictive use disorders, the predisposition to addictive use disorders, and then sort of the physiology for maintaining and continuing those cravings and triggers. And I really do want you guys to pay attention to all aspects of this chapter, and really think bigger, think bigger than uh, just beyond just sort of treatment. Think about all of the factors that come together in what is obviously just sort of this horribly perfect storm of a situation to result in why an individual uses and why an individual continues to use, and despite uh, efforts to maintain sobriety, that there is sort of the function of relapse is built in. So pay attention to that. Um, I did not know, if on page 267, I did not know this fact about the early hypodermic needles, and that increase in use led to um, it led to the development of these early hypodermic needles. That was pretty interesting to me. Um, let's see, we keep going through here. Just some general facts. Very early on in your chapter, that more prominent in young age, your book talks about sort of the phenomenon that happens where people can use early on, and maybe even use to the point where there's some pretty negative consequences, but they mature out of that use. They grow up, for a lack of a better way of describing this, that typically speaking, and all of you I think at this point have had lifespan and development. Typically speaking, these are phases that people go through, that again, if all is normal, within normal limits, and I'm using air quotes here because I don't know what normal is, but if all is within normal limits, that sort of risk-taking behavior and experimentation should sort of go away. The individual should grow out of it or mature out of it. And as you can see here, that 18 to 25 years of age is the greatest age range of abuse for illicit drug use, excuse me. And then you can see as you get older, that trend should decline. Um, let's see. Let me keep going through here. It fascinates me to find out how we use these substances very early on. So the idea that cocaine was pretty present in common day things that we consumed, what opium was used for very early on. And then what really fascinates me, and this is an area of interest that some of you, I believe, those of you that I had in issues and addiction, I believe you share this sort of fascination with me. Um, the idea that as a society, we just the concept of temperance movement and the concept of prohibition, it's all or nothing. So this concrete way of thinking, this is alcohol is causing problems in people, so we need to remove it completely from everybody and put such really negative and high stakes consequences associated with it. And we realized that didn't work very well. However, and this is what I find so very interesting. However, we still sort of somewhat have that same mentality. Now, we don't apply it as broadly as we did before, but we do tell people who have a problem with drugs of abuse or particularly alcohol, and some other substances that you cannot have it at all. So the abstinence only view, the abstinence only belief is still one that we carry and we hold to this day, even though we know that that's never really been super effective. That's not to say that it's not effective for some people, but we know that as human beings, um, removing everything has never really an abstinence approach has never really proven to be beneficial for human beings. And your book goes into that, and I think that this is a pretty interesting section here, sort of very early on. Yeah, so 270 highlights that. I've got that. As a matter of fact, I just flipped the page and I see that. So if you go to 270 in your book, go down to the first section on the right-hand side. Excuse me, the left-hand side. Several conclusions can be drawn, and then you see the first is that each time the federal government became more involved in drug regulation, the action resulted more in increasing drugs, um, increase in drug use. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about. Um, and yeah, here's the part of the hypodermic needle, that sort of increased some use, and that's pretty interesting to me. And what this chapter also goes into is the route of administration, and what we're going to touch on and what you're going to find as you continue to read is that it, injecting something that is mood altering directly into your bloodstream is sort of the fastest way to get at your desired outcome. However, it's the shortest duration. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. What I wanted to make sure that I talked about that. A little bit of history about some of the, about opium and where heroin was. Let's see. This early on again in this chapter talks about the disease model. I think at this point, all of you know that the moral model is not what we use as a way of explaining the etiology, development, and sort of maintenance of an addictive use disorder. People are not faulty, and that's not why that's not why they have such a substance use problem. They're not faulty human beings. They are human beings. So I say that now, and you'll probably hear me say that many, many, many times, but I hope that that is ingrained in your sort of language and mentality, and you know that there's nothing wrong with these human beings, despite the fact that oftentimes we unfortunately as a society treat people with addictive use disorders very differently, and we still in some ways, shapes, or form, a lot of ways actually resort back to this moral model and sort of moral failing. Um, all right. Let's see. I want to make sure that I touch on things. Harrison Act is really important. So it's sort of started the path to what we now know as schedules, and drugs that are under schedule, more controlled use of these substances, and that is now in the schedule that your chapter talks about, the schedule of drugs, the schedule and drug classes, that your book talks about on page 276. Let's see. Again, more about prohibition, um, development of DEA, and again, those 5 schedules of controlled substances. Um, the schedule chart that's on page 276 is pretty interesting. If you guys take a look at that, you can see what types of substances are in each of these different categories, and what it's used for. So, like Schedule 1, that it has no acceptable medical use, um, and a high abuse potential. So, there's no reason, let's say, uh, well, and you know what's interesting, and I have a note here as I'm looking at this, even as early as this book is and the description of what a Schedule 1 narcotic is, we are using now like microdosing. So the concept of microdosing with LSD, and certainly psilocybin, THC, we know there is some medical use. Um, uh, so I imagine that this may be looked at in the near future. The and possibly changed, because um, things are ever changing, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So let's see. On page 277, it starts talking about route of administration, and which way leads to the fastest benefit, greater benefit, more prolonged benefit, and all those answers are oftentimes different. Let's jump to that here. Mm, Well, actually, let me back up here. So this is a really important slide here, that it just starts off by saying it's complex, and that the definition is very, very, very difficult to come up with. And I would agree with that. And I would argue that most of you guys, I think at this point, probably do agree with it. But they break it down into physical dependence. They break it down into some behavioral components that include compulsive drug seeking. What we see in all addictive substances, and even the behaviors that we're looking at now as being addictive, let's say sex and eating and internet gaming or social networking, is that this compulsion, this inability to stop, this strong urge to continue to use, and that there's this the word craving, a craving to continue to use. We know that that seems to be pretty consistent. Jumping back again to that physical dependence, and so that can be that can include a physical or psychological withdrawal when the substance is stopped abruptly, or substance or behavior is stopped abruptly. Um, this section talks about remissions and relapses, and that's really important to know. It seems to be that remission and relapses are par for the course, and that's not to be minimized. It's important for us to be truthful and honest with the folks that we're working with. And how do we respond to a relapse? How do we respond to somebody who has had a sustained period of sobriety and then now has had some sort of lapse or a relapse, or a period of remission, if you will, like your chapter talks about? And that's largely philosophical. So, what does your theory say about these missteps? And missteps can be, you know, very large, or can be, very, very small amounts of times, or very long amount of time. They can be binges, they can be, a variety of different things. But it appears that a relapse or a lapse is par for the course. Unfortunately, that seems to go hand in hand with an addictive use disorder. And so that this is a nice segue, and this is sort of the scientific view of addiction. And of course, this chapter this class, my hope and my attempt is to go a little bit deeper into addictive use disorders than just the issues and addictions course. And so, looking at it from a scientific perspective, you can see very quickly that when this definition tries to provides some sort of description, relapse is right off the bat. Compulsion is right in there, and losing the ability to limit intake. You notice it didn't say stop. It says limit intake.